Hello students, welcome to this second session on Cleanth Brooks' essay, The Language of Paradox. In the previous session, we had a brief introduction with Cleanth Brooks as an influential figure in the field of new criticism. We had also discussed what are the key ideas of new criticism or how new criticism works with regard to the interpretation of literary texts, along with an introduction with Cleanth Brooks' seminal text, The Well-Wrought Urn. And today we would be looking into the key concept or the key idea of this very essay, The Language of Paradox. This essay was published in 1947 in the collection of the essays The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry. Students, this collection, as I have already mentioned, is a seminal text in New Critical School of Literary Criticism. And in this collection of essays, and especially in this very essay, The Language of Paradox, Brooks has given expression to his main argument or his key idea with regard to the theory of poetry, and his main argument is the best way to understand poetry is through the use of ambiguity and paradox, and how a critic can move forward while interpreting a poem through its complexity, through the use of paradox. For this very approach, Brooks has emphasized on the close reading and structural analysis of the text. And in this very essay, Brooks has very clearly explained that how a critic can interpret a poem well only through paradox, and his emphasis is on looking at text as an autonomous body. He just wants to interpret a poem in terms of looking at a system which underlies a text, and that system is created with how the words are used there in relation to one another, how a particular system operates there in terms of the structure of the poem, in terms of the use of the words, in terms of the use of imagery. And Brooks commences his essay with this pronouncement that few of us are prepared to accept the statement that the language of poetry is the language of paradox. But though the chief concern of the essay is to talk about that Cleanth Brooks believes in interpreting a poem or understanding a poem through the language of paradox, but at the same time Brooks is well aware of the traditional theorists or people in general, reader in general, who are not ready at all to accept that the language of the poetry is the language of paradox. But before moving further into the details about that why Cleanth Brooks favors language of paradox, and some of the critics or the traditional theorists, they are against the looking at poetry as the language of paradox. Now, first we will talk about what paradox is. If we look at the literal use of the paradox, paradox literally means a statement which appears to contradict itself. It's a sort of assertion or statement of unification of opposites. And to be more specific in terms of explaining paradox as a literary device, it is interpreted as that paradox is a literary device consisting of anomalous juxtaposition of incongruous ideas for the sake of striking exposition or unexpected insight. Means, in paradox, two opposing ideas are put together and just to give an unexpected or striking effect or impression to that very idea. For example, from John Donne's poem, "Death, thou shalt die." So this statement is in the form of paradox. So this is how paradox is literally used. This is how paradox is used as a literary device, as it is used in John Donne's poem, "Death, be not proud." And in this poem, there is a phrase, "Death, thou shalt die," that one day death has also to die. So if we look at the simple surface meaning of this very statement, we find that how it can be possible that death can die. So, but if we go through the complete text of the poem, I think all of you must have read this very poem during your undergraduation, that how toward the end of the poem, John Donne has proved through his arguments that death itself is not everlasting. Death is also to die when the soul moves to heaven or hell. So the point is that paradox is used just for the striking effects, and paradox consists of the juxtaposition of very opposing or contradictory ideas. And as far as the traditional criticism is concerned, it looks at paradox as a mere figure of speech, as it is used in John Donne's poem we have just seen. But when we talk about the new criticism, as it has been already mentioned and explained to you people in the previous session, that new criticism is concerned with the structural analysis. So here, while talking about the role of paradox in understanding a poem, there is a deviation from the common perception of the term paradox. Means, new criticism does not look at paradox as a mere figure of speech. What they have done? The new critics have elevated the term paradox to a position which is helpful in comprehending, in explaining that how its explication can encompass a range of surprising meanings in a particular text. And in his essay, Brooks is aware of the objections or the disapproval by the traditional criticism of using paradox in poetry. And he just begins by pointing out these objections in this very essay. He has pointed out that generally it is believed that paradox is hardly the language of soul, and poetry is something which is considered to be directly connected with soul or heart. But paradox is not the language of the soul, then how it can be the language of poetry? The second objection is that paradox is the language of sophistry. Paradox is the language of hard, bright and witty. Then how it can be the language of poetry, which is to deal with emotions? And thirdly, Brooks points out that paradox is generally considered, I quote, intellectual rather than emotional, clever rather than emotional, clever rather than profound, rational rather than divinely irrational. So the point is that paradox is not considered to be a suitable language for poetry, because poetry is something which is more for emotions rather than intellectual, and it is poetry is considered to be the something which appeals to the soul and which originates from the soul. So paradox is generally, or the traditional criticism doesn't look at paradox as a suitable form or as a suitable language for poetry. They find that paradox is suitable for epigram. Epigram is a sub-variety of poetry. The very short poems filled with meaning, they are the epigrams. Then secondly, there are the satires. So the traditional critics, they think that paradox is suitable as far as the satire is concerned. So in this way, on the whole, Brooks is pointing out that it is at some place our prejudice against the use of paradox, which forces us to look at paradox as something intellectual rather than emotional, clever rather than profound, but this is not the sense. How? Brooks writes in the essay, I quote, "Yet there is a sense in which paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry." Here the point is that Brooks, no doubt in the very opening of the essay, Brooks has pointed out several objections with regard to the meaning of paradox. But he himself has used it in extended terms. He has just extended the meaning of paradox as far as its function in poetry is concerned. And Brooks has, I would like to say that Brooks assigns a greater function to paradox. He believes that paradox lends a dramatization of experience, of a poet's experiences, because a poet's experiences are very diverse. A poet's experiences are crude. So that very diversity, that very dissonance, the common and crude experiences can be unified, or that to unify the complexity of human existence or human experience is only possible through the paradoxes only. So the chief concern behind this whole emphasis on the use of paradox in analyzing or interpreting a poem, Brooks have this contention in his mind that language of a poet is different from the language of a scientist. So the whole argument about the important role or the function of paradox in poetry is based on this very contention, that the language of the poet is different from the language of science, because it is the scientist whose truth requires a language purged of every trace of paradox. But apparently, and it's very clear, that the truth which the poet speaks, the truth which the poet explains or expresses in his poetry, can be approached only in terms of paradox. Why? Because poet's experiences are different from the scientist. What is poet's experience, or what poet has to do? The poet has to unify the complexity of human existence. So here, this is the main reason that he has to use the words with different interpretations. But the same is not with science. Because in science, the tendency of science is necessarily to stabilize terms. Stabilize terms means one word has a one fixed meaning or interpretation, and that meaning is freezed into strict denotations. But the poet's tendency is, by contrast, disruptive. Means he is not freezing, he is not stabilizing a particular word in terms of a specific interpretation. Here the words have varied interpretations. When a word's relation with the another word changes, its meaning and interpretation also changes. A same word can be used differently in poetry, but in science, this is not the case. So, in this way, the paradoxes the paradox originate from the very nature of the poet's language. I just re-explain the very thing that poet's language. What is the poet's language? Poet's language is the medium to unify the complexity of human experience. Poets and the poet's experience are diverse. Poet's experiences are common and crude. So to just unify all this complexity of emotions, of experiences, the poet has to work upon the different meanings of a particular word, or the different meanings of a system of words which operates within a text. So, in the poet's language, the connotations play as great a part as denotation. So, here is the key point, students, that Brooks is interested in looking into the connotative meanings of the words along with their denotative meanings. As far as the language of the science is concerned, the denotations are very important. But in poetry, the connotations, the deeper meanings, the layered meanings of the words also play an important role. So how the layered meaning of the words give us a specific form, a specific interpretation to particular text. That is the contention, that is the argument that Brooks is making. And he further says in the very opening part of the essay that the poet within limits has to make up his language as he goes. Means that when the poet is interested in the connotative meaning of the word. So here Brooks doesn't mean that the connotations are important as supplying some sort of frill or some sort of trimming or something external to the real matter in hand. He want to say that the poet doesn't use a notation at all, as the scientist may properly be said to do so. The poet just changes the relationship between the words as far as the requirement of the very idea which he wants to express, as far as the requirement of the context which his text is providing him. So, in this way, in the opening part of the essay, Brooks has mentioned two things clearly, that how there are objections against the use of paradox in the interpretation of poem, or looking at paradox as the language of poetry, and he talks about that those very objections are based on the very interpretation of the term, that how paradox is interpreted only as the language of intellect. Paradox is explained as the language of sophistry, of heart, bright and witty. It is hardly believed to be the language of the soul. And on the other hand, poetry has direct connection with soul, so that how it can be the suitable language for poetry. So this is how Brooks has pointed out the general traditional objections against the use of the language of paradox for the language of poetry. But in the very second paragraph of this essay, he has just made his own point clear, that why he thinks that paradox is the language appropriate for poetry, because he looks at the language of the poet something different from the language of science. Because the language of the scientist, in the language of the scientist, every word has a singular specific meaning, but in the poet's language, the words change. The words are mutable. The words change, their meanings change when their relationships with the other words change. When they are placed in different contexts, their meanings change. So this is how Brooks has looked at paradox, and he has looked at the extended meaning of the paradox. That's why he talks about language as the appropriate language for poetry, and the same he has illustrated with examples from William Wordsworth's poems, from an extract from Alexander Pope also. So in our next session we will talk about that how the language of paradox is the language of poetry. It is illustrated through Wordsworth's poems. Thank you.